Welcome to The Aggressive Life. In August 1914, the outbreak of World War I, a ship called the Endurance left British waters attempting to make history. The Empiric Dirt.
Imperial.
The Imperial.
Did I spell that wrong?
Wow. No, you didn't. I just said it wrong. The Imperial Transatlantic Expedition. I'm so excited today, Dirt, because I've been wanting this guest for a long time. I can't even read straight.
I'm real excited.
This is like one of my favorite stories of all time.
I cannot wait.
That's not in the Bible, by the way. That's not in the Bible. Here, the Imperial Transatlantic Expedition was the brainchild of Arctic explorer Ernest Shackleton. The crew was aiming to make the first overland crossing of the Antarctic continent. It would be a venture of some 1,800 miles. And though they never set foot on the frozen continent, what happens next is one of the most inspiring stories in history. And for Professor Nancy Koehn, it provides a masterclass in what it takes to lead through crisis. After 7 weeks of perilous sailing, the Endurance became stuck in ice in early 1915, surviving for 10 months on the ship. The ice finally began to tear it apart. Shackleton ordered his men to abandon ship, setting up camp on the ice. 25 days later, the ship sank to the bottom of the Weddell Sea, and that was just the beginning of the story. Shackleton would lead his men across the ice in lifeboats. They sailed for 5 days to reach Elephant Island, an uninhabited island far from any shipping routes. And from there, Shackleton and 5 crew members sailed 800 miles in a lifeboat to the nearest inhabited island for help. When they finally landed there, they faced a grueling 36-hour trek over mountains and unmarked terrain to reach a primitive whaling station 4 months later. Shackleton returned to Elephant Island to rescue the rest of his crew, and everyone survived. Everyone. There's so much more to the story, and Dr. Nancy Koehn is going to unpack it all for us. She's an historian at the Harvard Business School, where she holds the James E. Robinson Chair of Business Administration, and with multiple books and work that has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and beyond, she focuses on how leaders, past and present, craft lives of purpose, worth, and impact. Her most recent book is fantastic. It's called Forged in Crisis. It highlights the lives of 5 historical leaders, and maybe we'll get into those. Maybe I'm just going to monopolize her on Ernest Shackleton because, Dirt, I am an Ernest Shackleton fan.
I know you are.
And I'm always the most educated on Ernest Shackleton in the room, except
Until
now.
today.
I have a woman who's going to clean the floor with my pity knowledge that she has. So, welcome to The Aggressive Life, Dr. Nancy Koehn.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a huge pleasure to be here.
Man, it's a pleasure to have you. I have been trying to get somebody on this podcast for a while to talk about this. This book captured my imagination. I want to say I read that book called The Endurance. I must have read that 28 years ago, probably maybe 30 years ago. And have read everything I could on the topic and have just always found it fascinating. Just sort of find somebody who's done a hyper deep dive and knows she's talking about is really good. So this is good. Tell me, Nancy, how did you get interested in Ernest Shackleton with that brief bio I gave? How did you come across the story and what drew you to it?
So I have learned most of my history and gotten interested in most of the people I've studied through falling into a canyon of interest on some subject. So early in this millennium, maybe even in the very late 90s, I got fascinated, not for the first time, but in a much more intense way, fascinated with the race for the South Pole, the race to be the first to discover the South Pole, which occurred in its most dramatic fashion and ultimately culminated in the discovery of the South Pole in 1911 and 1912. And it was a Norwegian team captained by a brilliant explorer and leader named Roald Amundsen, racing against a British team captained by a much less impressive leader named Robert Falcon Scott. And they were literally racing on the Antarctic continent to be the first to get to the pole. And it began it put the first glimmer in my eye, the courageous leadership made all the difference because Amundsen gets to the pole ahead of schedule, discovers it, plants the Norwegian flag, races back with his dogs and his men. They gain weight. They have so much food stored. They end up throwing off canned goods from the dog sleds as they race back to base camp, having discovered the pole, which were later discovered in our time, those canned goods. And meanwhile, poor Scott, insecure, unable to make decisions with conviction, right? Takes too many men, doesn't have enough food, doesn't have the right transport, and dies on the way back from the pole. He gets to the pole about a month after Amundsen in a few days, discovers the Norwegian flag, and the men trek back where they die of scurvy and starvation on the way back. Their bodies are discovered 9 months later. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. And when you start looking at this dramatic moment in history called the heroic age of exploration, all these countries vying to be the first to the South Pole, you can't help finding everywhere you turn. It's like a major intersection of several like highways. Ernest Shackleton, he's just all over the stories in lots of ways because he was a real presence in the race for the South Pole. And then after the South Pole is discovered, in this attempt to make himself famous by being the first to march across the Antarctic continent. And that's what you're talking about. So I discover Ernest Shackleton, I'm like, this is a great story. It's a story of failure, but it's a story of the triumph of great leadership and the human spirit and the power of recruiting a great team and a whole bunch of other really important lessons for leaders. And I decided to write a Harvard Business School case about it. And that is the beginning of my long and in-depth research love affair with Ernest Shackleton and his team.
It is. Your book says it very well, Forged in Crisis. It is the crisis moments that really stand out to us. That's what makes a good read. Like Amundsen, I remember hearing Jim Collins, talk about, who's business leadership guru, for those who may not know him. He talks about highlighting Amundsen versus Scott and says Amundsen did the 10-mile march. He just said every day we're going to log 10 miles. Even if you feel great and we go another few, nope, 10 miles. And if we feel like horrible, no, make it 10 miles, like measured consistency. Those stories that come out of these intense crucible adventure stories, I find incredibly inspiring. Why is that?
I think crises, and this is as someone who studies crises, they hold our interest because they're dramatic. That's really important. But in terms of what you're asking about, Brian, they are also these forges, these like crucibles for people and groups to get better, to make themselves better in a high stakes situation. And the best I can reconstruct it, and this is what I write about, is that in a crisis, everyone listening, remember COVID and remember how your group, your family, your company, your neighborhood dealt with COVID. You have to think of new ways of doing things. The old or the traditional standard operating procedures don't necessarily hold. So there's all this creativity that happens. You do that in a very innovative way. You discover, here's truth number 2, more innovation. Truth number 2, more courage. We're braver than we realize, and crises help us learn and discover that and access that. 3, you discover new resilience in yourself, right? The ability to find in the midst of adversity, grounding and focus and opportunity and clarity. But I think the most important thing is that people start making conscious and unconscious bets with themselves. They say, I got to raise the level of my game. This is Lincoln in the middle of the Civil War. I got to figure out how to hold this nation together, what the war is really about, and then how to win a war to hold the country as one. And in that leading of oneself, you actually experience, or what is actually happening is that crises become a greenhouse for the strengthening of individuals. They get forged in crisis. And that's what my book is about, and how that happens, which is mostly through a series of small, not very dramatic, not very Hollywood-like actions that add up to real impact and to worthy action, worthy deeds, and often a great legacy.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that's why those of us who have read Shackleton are just so inspired, because we can't help but ask ourselves, what would I have done if I was on the Endurance? What would I have done? Or if I was leading How would I have possibly been able to lead those folks? Of course, part of the magic there was the kind of guy who was attracted there. It's pretty famous. You probably know it by heart. I'll read it unless you know it by heart. The ad that Shackleton put in the newspaper to get people to show up for his voyage. Did you memorize it by heart? You Harvard professor, you master of the brain.
You read it for our audience, and then I will say something about it when you're ready.
Great. So he puts this in the paper. He wants to do this journey, and here's his pitch to get people to be on his crew. Small ad says this: men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Ernest Shackleton, 4 Burlington Street. That's it. That's his pitch. And they are lined up out the door to sign up for this adventure. Jeez, you put something like that in the paper today, you're going to get laughed at. But that's the kind of person who's attracted to it.
So, all right. So let me say a couple of things. First, he had 5,000 applicants to join his crew. That ad may or may not have actually been placed by Ernest Shackleton. We should all know that, right? It may have been placed. It may not have been. It's really, the historical record is not clear. Let's leave it at that. But here's the important thing: his name. And the important thing is what the gist of the ad and the gist of his pitch to people was. The gist of his hiring was, come in, and are you ready for this? Long days of complete darkness, honor and recognition in case of success. But remember, safe return doubtful. So in modern language, in modern sensibilities, what is he doing? And this is what's so brilliant. Regardless of whether the ad is real or not, in terms of Ernest Shackleton placing it, what he's doing, and this is so important, and people forget it. And I use this case with executives all the time, and sometimes it takes a while to get here on this. What was he doing with this ad? Whether he placed it or not, what's the intention? The intention is to hire for attitude, hire for outlook, and then train for skill in some ways. I mean, he is looking for surgeons, and he's looking for a geologist, and he wants a photographer because he wants to film and photograph everything so he can make money on the adventure when he gets home. I mean, there's lots of, if you will, functional expertise that he needs, but it's all about what's your attitude going to be in this very high stakes environment.
Yes.
It's just really, as Herb Keller, who was for a long time the CEO and was the founder of Southwest Airlines, said, it's just very, very expensive to hire a bad attitude. And it's even more expensive when the work you're going to do is going to be in an environment where, survival is always an issue because of the climate and because of the situation, right? And because of just the circumstances. So that's what Shackleton does. Now, we do know that when he got 5,000 people, so he has the cream of the crop to pick from, he runs them through, and my book details this, he runs lots of his applicants through a kind of audition to see what he's got in terms of attitude. And then he hires, ultimately, 26. There'll be a 27th person who will join the expedition. There'll be 28 people, including Shackleton, on the ice. But he hires people who he thinks have not only a realistic outlook on what they're going to and are up for it. These are people who are excited by the high stakes, the high risk situation, but also who he believes are going to default on the side of optimism. And here's the key thing, Brian. I've been studying this case for 25 years. I still marvel at how they survived, but I still marvel. And I think this piece of the story, how he put the team together and their attitude, was enormously important. Because what we know about very, very high-risk survival situations, whether it's a plane crashing in the Andes, right, or getting up and getting down from Everest as John Krakauer's Into Thin Air, is teams disintegrate. People's will to live, right, really atrophies. And so if you don't start with cohesion and optimism, credible, healthy, practical optimism, you're already handicapped in a situation in which, again, survival is always going to be a potential issue.
Nancy, I feel like you and I should be spending hours together having beers. I don't know if you drink or not, but I just want to talk forever on this topic. And so let's start at the beginning. And because people, we're not still giving our audience yet any idea of the superhuman endurance. Fascinating, the ship was called the Endurance, but literally the superhuman endurance of this. And we've all seen enough National Geographic things with penguins and ice and snow that we've got something in our mind. But let's go back to the beginning and talk about this. Let's start with their ship is in the ocean and it can't move anywhere because of ice. And the ice starts to crack the hull of the ship in the center of the ocean. Take us there.
Okay, so let me just a brief prologue for readers, listeners who aren't really, really familiar with this. As Brian said at the top of the conversation, Shackleton leaves England just as war is breaking out. Winston Churchill, who's the second secretary of the Navy, gives him permission. He says, proceed with your exploratory journey. The boat sails down to South America to gather supplies. They then sail. So this is late 1915. They then sail for the last outpost, a little island called South Georgia, which we're going to come to later, has a whaling station on it. The men gather up their mail and their last supplies, and the whalers there tell them, you really need to hold up here till the warmer weather comes, which, of course, is the southern hemisphere. It's the opposite of our time, because there's really a lot of icebergs and pack ice far north. So you really need to hold up. Shackleton stays on the island for 1 month to early December 1914, and he says, I can't wait any longer. He's very restless. Shackleton is very restless at this point in the journey. He wants to get there. And so they sail towards Antarctica. They actually get, by the second week of January, roughly January 17th, they get to a point, the ship and the 28 men on it, where they can see the coastline. They're 80 miles from the coastline. And lots of the crew members say, let's dock in here, Captain. And Shackleton said, well, they actually called him the boss. Shackleton says, no, we can get a little better position on the coast for base camp if we sail a little bit longer. And in those 2 days, all those icebergs lock the ship in a vice. So there are photographs of the ship sitting straight upright in the sea of white, like it's in a parking lot, and all the men standing in front of it. That's how locked they were.
Yeah, they're getting off and playing hockey and having fun, playing kickball. Playing hockey
and proper English football, because Shackleton's really intent on managing. Lesson number 3 of Shackleton, manage your team's energy, on keeping their energy positive, right? Engaged, right? And not worrying about whether we're going to survive. And by the way, he still thinks there's a chance that if the ice cracks and thaws, they can make the overland journey. So he hasn't given up yet. Well, the ship is locked at the end of January. It's locked at the end of February. It's locked all the way into the winter months in the southern hemisphere, which of course are our summer months. And by the end of August, the ship is starting, this is where Brian took us, is starting to crack, the ice is pushing against the ship, like again in a vice, and it's starting to crack it. And Shackleton knows that the ship is gonna be basically be crushed by the ice. He doesn't tell the men right away. They're still living on the ship, right? And with all kinds of duty rosters and chores and things to keep life routine, to keep the men centered, grounded, and positive. Well, that the ice's onslaught, attack of the ship intensifies in September and October. And on October 27th, 1915, they have to abandon ship. And the men start making a very crude base camp in something they call dump camp, salvaging stuff from the ship and setting up a camp on the ice. So now we have arrived at early November 1915. In 3 weeks, November 21st, the ship will go in 1 day, 8 hours, will go down through the ice, and the ice will completely close over.
That is nutso. And so they get all these supplies off of the ship, their supplies they're going to need for, at that point, Nancy, do you think that Shackleton knows how long their journey is going to be? Do you think he has any clue?
No, this is the really interesting thing about Shackleton. So talk about, kind of making it up as you go along, right? So his first mission, remember his original mission, be the first team of men to walk across the continent and be a new kind of hero and pioneer in the heroic age Arctic exploration. And now that mission is over, right? As soon as the ship starts to get aggressively attacked by the ice, he knows mission number 2. And this is one of the very interesting things about Shackleton. He's like, done with that mission, face forward, new mission, get all the men home alive. So, I think this is a really important aspect of Shackleton. I try and teach this to my high achieving, controlling type A leaders that I work with at Harvard Business School. You have to let go sometimes completely of objective 1, right? When that goes aground, so to speak, or gets stuck in the ice, and turn and embrace mission number 2, the next thing, right? Plan B. And he's so good at that. Like the self-discipline that he exercises, right? I'm done with the fame thing. I got to save these guys. And so I don't think he knows, Brian. I think he knows this is what we're doing today and tomorrow. And that's as far ahead as he can go in terms of saving the men. And so that's lesson number 4. Right? And he says this to himself. So another interesting aspect of the ship going down and the ice closing over. Think for a second about how disturbing this is to a crew of seamen. The radio doesn't work. They are thousands of miles from civilization. And Shackleton's first
and no Coast Guard. There ain't no Coast Guard.
No Coast Guard, no cell phone, no, hey, let's post something on Facebook and have people come down and help us out. No, right? Nothing. And he knows how harrowing this will be for the men. So that night, the ship goes down. Frank Hurley, who's the prickly, very talented photographer who's along, says that he watched Shackleton pace the ice talking to himself. So lesson number 5 from Shackleton is most of what leaders do is lead themselves. Leaders have to be good coaches and good cheerleaders and good critics of themselves, and all great leaders learn to do that. So what he's doing, and we know this because all the men kept diaries and Shackleton did too, is he's coaching himself, and he literally writes this: a man must shape himself to a new mark the moment the old mark goes aground. So there he is saying, new mission, get his men's spirits up and believing they're going to survive, even though the ship just went down. So the next morning, he hasn't slept. He and Frank Wild, who's his right-hand person, who had been with him on another expedition to the Antarctic that didn't succeed, but wasn't mired in disaster like this one. They open each flap of the tent and they hand each man milk and tea, milky tea. And Shackleton says, lads, gather round. And it's almost like, if you know the movie Henry V with Kenneth Branagh, or the Shakespeare play, more importantly, that's based on, it's like the St. Crispin's Day speech. We're going to have a pep talk. And what he says, and this is really important because all the men that survive and live into the 1930s, when the BBC will interview all the survivors, they will all repeat this incident.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
And what he says is, ship and stores gone now, lads. We'll go home. And he was so confident in the way he said it. And he was so no nonsense that all these people that recounted their experience with Shackleton in this extraordinary story, like 20 years later, remembered that. Each man to a one said, when the BBC reporters asked them, how did you survive? Each man said, the boss made us believe we could do it. So this incredibly important aspect of leadership, where the leader holds the mission and helps create the idea, inspires the people that he leads or she leads to believe in the mission and believe that they can do it in a realistic way. Credible real optimism and realism. And that is a really important piece of this story. So that's where they are in November 22nd, 1915. But it's not looking too hopeful, right? They're a long way. We got no one looking for us. No one knows where we are. No one expects to hear from us because they think we're crossing the Antarctic. So that's the situation at dump camp on the first day after the ship goes down.
Yeah, so they get off the ship, and then that's phase one is the ship is running ice, not aground, running ice. Phase 2 is everyone gets off. What's phase 3?
Phase 3 is they're settling into life on the ice. Now, you said in your important and well-spoken intro, Brian, that, he tries at a couple of points, Shackleton tries to lead the men they have dog sleds because they're going to make a sledding journey originally across the continent, and they have sled dogs. Shackleton had a salary fight with a dog trainer in South America, so he didn't come, so no one knew how to really use these sled dogs, but they start training them on the ice. But phase 3 is settling into life on the ice. So one of the things that Shackleton does fairly early on is to say, let's try and find open water. They have 3 lifeboats, which were salvaged from the Endurance, all named for contributors, donators to the mission. And they hitch up the dog sleds with the lifeboats on them and provisions, and they try to sail across the jagged, uneven iceberg to find open water, thinking they'll then be able to head north along what is basically a set of islands. The archipelago of the Atlantic side of the Antarctic is a series of islands running up the western side of the continent. And some of those islands are actually places where ships stop, so they can go far enough north up that archipelago. They may get help. Well, the problem with this plan, there are many plans here, they keep jettisoning them if they don't work, is the ice is so jagged and the dogs aren't well trained enough this early on to get them. To move the stuff that they just can't move very far. So after 3 days, they've moved 3 miles. And Shackleton, whoa, we're stopping. We're building another camp right here. So again, the ability to say, no, this is sapping my men's mental and physical energy. We're going to stop here. And so they build camp where every detail is subject to Shackleton's keen eye and calculating sense of management and leadership. For example, duty rosters go up here, right? Every day at 6 a.m., the Union Jack goes up. Every day at sunset, the Union Jack comes down. Every day, the men have to do a 3-mile exercise program around the iceberg to keep them in shape and get them the benefits of exercise. Everyone shifts every week with the duties. This week, Thomas Greeley is going to go kill seals. Next week, it'll be Lionel Greenstreet, etc. So this routine and this attention to detail has a lot to do with keeping the men very grounded. Even who's in which tent, how the tent assignments are made, is part of Shackleton's filter. So, for example, he takes 3 of the men he believes are potentially toxic, more pessimistic, more, whinging. No, we can't do that. The whiners.
Oh, I like that whining voice. I like that whining voice. Do that whining voice again. I like that.
Yeah, no, I don't think so, Mr. Shackleton. But he puts those men in his tent so you can keep the toxic folks inside the tent and manage them right. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Or as Lyndon Johnson, I'm not sure he really coined this, but he definitely said it once, said, better to have them inside the tent peeing out than outside the tent peeing in. So the idea was we don't want these men spreading contagion, so Shackleton keeps them close. So again, he's very good at establishing a kind of order that the men both feel demands their respect in terms of him, but also leaves them, right, gives them responsibility and gives them a sense of cohesion as a team. Right. Last point on this phase 3. He's come up through the hierarchy of the merchant marine, and to a more limited extent, he's not really part of the British Navy, but he understands the British Navy very well. Hierarchies, right? That England in the late 19th and early 20th century is a land of hierarchies. And one of the things he decides to do as soon as he realizes that it's mission 2, is to mix the men by rank. So some of the folks who are there's a couple of physicians along. They will, for example, hunt seals with the enlisted sailors, completely mixing hierarchies, right? Senior officers will, cook dinner or help cook dinner with enlisted men. And he wants to do that to do 2 things. One, as People will say later when they talk about the actual expert witnesses will say later when they remember the voyage, they'll say he wanted to keep men from getting proud, or he didn't want hierarchical pride to get in the way of team cohesion. And then 2, to help the men grow to like and know each other in a way that wasn't filtered strictly by rank. And again, think how important that turns out to be when the stakes are high and the last thing you want is intra-team discord.
Yeah. You talked about problem people, problem personalities. Every time I look in the stories, I'm always surprised that he was able to keep Thomas Ord-Lees in, I think that's how you say him, is right? Ord-Lees?
Yeah.
In line. This guy just had a bad attitude from day one, and he was a pretty burly guy. He could have wreaked some real havoc, and he somehow kept him in line.
There were several people. There was a guy named McCarthy and a guy named Vincent, and then there was the carpenter, a guy named McNeish. They called him Chippy McNeish.
Oh, right, because he was chippy, yeah.
But the carpenter was difficult too. They were difficult. They were just difficult. They didn't want to believe that they were going to survive. They wanted things their way. And there's a second set of marches that Shackleton attempts across the ice in the middle of this phase 3, which lasts from the time the ship goes down. That's late November 1915, all the way to early April 1916, when the men take to lifeboats for open water. So phase 3 is that. But there's another overland march attempt. At one point, Chippy McNeish, basically the carpenter, threatens mutiny. Right, and Shackleton can't have mutiny; they'll die if we mutiny. He just can't. So he again, very creatively on the spot, right, puts the mutiny down by saying, because McNeish says, I'm done. I'm not following orders anymore. We're not getting anywhere. You're not going to pay us, because maritime law at that time said that once a ship went down, the crew didn't have to be paid. So McNeish is like, you're not paying us. I don't have to follow yours. Shackleton does something very, very brilliant. He says, first, I will pay you till we get to London. I will pay you personally. And that relieves a collective question and gets people on the side of Shackleton. They're debating about whether there's anything to McNeish's protest. And then he walks away and comes back with the virtuous lie. Walks away to stand. Says, I'm coming back with ship's articles. You swore when you signed on to this voyage an oath of loyalty to me, which is really a fib. But he wants the men to hold on to this sense that even though the ship is down, they're still Shackleton, the commander of the expedition, and they owe liege and loyalty to him. And of course, both these actions, the payment, saying I'll pay you all the way to London even though the ship went down a month ago or 2 months ago, and you owe loyalty to me, that completely shuts down McNeish and his mutinous instincts. And that's the last real protest or challenge to Shackleton's authority. Right. So again, see he's not trying to be a dictator. He's trying to keep the men working towards surviving. It's all, again, partly improvisational, but the thing that's so really impressive here about Shackleton throughout the time when the ship starts getting attacked by the ice is how once the mission is keep them all home alive, he won't budge from that. He'll play any card. He'll do anything he has to do that. So this combination of like stubborn adherence to the mission and all this suppleness and flexibility about how you do it, that's a very important lesson for leaders in crisis.
Yeah, it's also an interesting philosophy question to have, which I have a very strong view on, you probably do too, is would you rather have, say, Shackleton and one other guy who are trying to survive, or this whole large team? I think the whole large team is part of why they were able to survive. I'm not sure if just two dudes can do it.
I agree. There were so many pieces to how these men stayed, got enough calories, right? Just put it that way.
Yes.
Stayed warm enough, right? The average temperature in like summer is 26 Fahrenheit in the Antarctic, and the average temperature in like winter is like minus 38 degrees. So just staying warm and staying alive and being able to stay cohesive enough, to your point, it really took this village of 28 people to keep them all alive, was absolutely essential. And there are so many moving parts to this. So let me move on to the next phase, if I might, Brian.
Yep.
Phase 4, when in April, so food stocks run low by the end of January and the beginning of February. Men are getting worried, right? There isn't so much seal and penguin to hunt. They're mostly living off seal and penguin and some of the canned goods salvaged from the ship. And Shackleton decides one day in the middle of their summer, it's the end of January 1916, that he'll order up double rations for the week. And so he doubles all the rations. They're on ration. We eat this much meat, we eat this much canned milk, blah, blah. And it makes such a difference. You read the diaries and the men's spirits are all just lifted because they're eating more and they feel better. And it gives them the sense that we're okay. And there's this wonderful line from one of the men that he said, double rations today feel full as a tick. And it's just such a great example of when he'll lay the chips down, right? They're scarce food. They're going to lay extra chips down to keep his men's morale high.
Yeah, that's really good.
So great leaders in crisis have to face trade-offs. And again, the morale of your people is so vitally important. So to get to phase 4, at the beginning, they realize they're going to have to sail up back to the original plan. We're going to have to sail up open water, find open water and sail up some of these islands. And they want to get high enough that a trading ship will find them in this archipelago of islands stretching up, if you will, the kind of western flank of Antarctica. And so on April 9th, they watch and wait for the ice to break up. On April 9th, they get a clear path, and they fill the lifeboats with as much as they can take. The men, 28 men in 3 lifeboats, and they set sail with what today we would consider incredibly crude navigational equipment. A brilliant navigator, Frank Worsley, but crude navigational equipment, sailing basically northwest. It's a harrowing boat journey that takes 6 nights. Harrowing, 7 days, 6 nights. Harrowing. We don't necessarily need to dive into it. I'll just give you one example. At one point, they're going to sleep on an iceberg. They pull the boats and pull them up on an iceberg, and the ice cracks, and one of the men drops in to the ice, and Shackleton fishes him out by his collar, and that's the last of sleeping on icebergs. They're going to take turns rowing and sleeping in the boats, and it's so cold. And at one point, someone loses a mitten, and Shackleton says, "Take mine." And the guy says, "No, I can't. And he says, "Take mine." And Shackleton threatens to throw his mittens off the side of the boat, and the guy takes the mittens. And there's all these things he's doing to keep his men. Yeah. It's just a disaster. Shackleton will stand up in the main lifeboat. They tie the lifeboats together to keep them together. Stand up for the last 24 hours, basically, to show the men, kind of like George Washington crossing the Delaware, that we're going to get there. And they finally, stumble on April 15th. They pull into the first island they can get to, which is this slip of an island, basically nothing there but barnacles, called Elephant Island. And the men are ecstatic. They find fresh water. They're ecstatic because it's the first time they've been on dry land since basically, early December of 1914. So, but here we are, it's April 15th, and a year and a half later, or a year and 4 months later, and now we're on dry land. And Shackleton immediately.
Just stop right there. A year and 4 months until you're on dry land, and not horrible.
I mean, well, think about it, right? They left South Georgia on December 5th. That was the last time on dry land. They're in the ship, or they're on the ice for the ensuing 16 months.
Sheesh. Unbelievable. Taking care of your health isn't always easy, but it should be at least simple. That's why for the last 2 years, I've been drinking AG1 every day, no exceptions, at home, on a hunting trip, camping off my motorcycle, no exceptions. It's just 1 scoop mixed in water once a day, every day, and it makes me feel ready to get moving. That's because each serving of AG1 delivers my daily dose of vitamins, minerals, pre- and probiotics, and more. It's a powerful, healthy habit that's also powerfully simple. I like to have it in the morning. I have a 12 ounce of water, so right off the bat, I'm helping my hydration every single morning. This is the one product, if I had to recommend one, I'd recommend this one to elevate your health. It's AG1, and that's why I partner with them for 2 years. So if you want to take ownership of your health, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 plus K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/aggressivelife. That's drinkag1.com/aggressivelife. Get yourself some. Big news. The final book in the 5 Marks of a Man library, a 60-day devotional, officially releases on December 3rd. It's chock full of original teaching, scripture, prayers, challenges to get you off the bench and into the game. You're going to grow in what you practice. And this book is all about that, focusing on and growing each of the 5 marks in your life until they become second nature. What are they? Men have a vision. Men take a minority position. Men are team players. Men work, and men are protectors. The 5 Marks of Man devotional, 60 Days to a Powerful Life, is a perfect gift for men of all ages, whether they're 13 or 103. Pre-order it on Amazon, and the book is guaranteed to arrive on release day, December 3rd, which means you'll have it right on time to follow along with some special things we have planned just for you, our podcast listeners. Find the 5 Marks for a Man devotional on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. Now let's get on with the show.
So now we get to phase, I guess, 5, because Shackleton realized the island they've reached, Elephant Island, along this strip, this arm, if you will, isn't very high up on the arm. He wanted to get to something like Clarence Island or Paulette Island. You needn't remember these names. Just trust me, they're farther north, so they're more likely to be sighted or stopped at a place a ship might stop. He knows on Clarence Island, for example, there's stores, cash, supplies that are cached there from former ships. Well, we're not there, and we can't actually sail too much farther west because we can't. Well, those islands are to the west because we're sailing against the west winds. So he's like, oh boy, this isn't going to work. No one's going to find us here, and there's not a lot of food. There is fresh water. I got to make the next plan, right? Yep. So he decides almost the day they arrive. They arrive on April 15th. By April 16th, he's decided we're going to shore up one of these lifeboats and we're going to sail east with the west winds behind us, build a sail, and sail east and go back to South Georgia, which is about 800 miles east and somewhat north of where they were. And through some of the most hazardous waters in the Atlantic Ocean. But we're going to do it because we got to go get help. And he knows there's help on South Georgia where the whaling station is.
Yeah. This is, if you're intrigued at all to read a really great story, that book called The Endurance is the first one I read. It was really great. And just the stuff that you don't think about, like they've got to get rocks and put it on the bottom of the boat so it has some sort of keel, some sort of ballast. And they stretch canvas over the top of this boat, and they're down and they're sleeping on rocks. It starts to leak, and they've got their hair sleeping bags, and it stinks, and it's rock. And you just, oh my gosh, I can't imagine doing that for a day. And they did it for how long?
So it takes them about 9 days, 8 days to get the James Cairn, which was one of the lifeboats, built. You said it brilliantly. Deck, build a mast, put a mast up, sail, canvas deck, lots of rocks in the bottom, and off we go. Shackleton with 5 men. Thomas Crean, who was a very trusted, very hardy explorer who'd been to the Antarctic before. Frank Worsley, the navigator, because someone's got to get you to this tiny, tiny dot in the Atlantic Ocean. If you miss South Georgia, the next stop is like Cape Town. So you don't want to miss it, right? Yep. So Frank Worsley and his sextet, you don't need to worry about it. It's a crude navigational device that demands the sun to make measurements to determine longitude and latitude. And then two difficult men, because he doesn't want to leave them, back on Elephant Island with Frank Wild, who he's put in charge of the remaining men, 22 men, because he doesn't want to leave them because they'll so contagion. They'll just be spreading their negativity. So off we go. They leave on April 24th, 1916. It takes them 17 days to get on May 10th to the wrong side of South Georgia. They're on the wrong side because it's a mountainous, as you said in your introduction, it's a mountainous, completely uncharted, it's never been mapped, island which on the eastern side is the whaling station, but nothing on the western side. They have to stop on that side because the rudder has come off the James Cairn. And they are out of fresh water. So it's an emergency landing. Shackleton knows it's the wrong side of the island, but he doesn't think he can get the boat to go round to the other side the way it's broke because it needs repair. So we stop on that side. He leaves Vincent and McCarthy, the two troublemakers, to, kill some birds, some seabirds, and, make camp on that side. And he and Koehn and Worsley, three, set off on this unchartered, as Brian said, for 36 hours. They just an extraordinary trip up. They get too high. They don't see a way down. Shackleton thinks they'll freeze the first night, so he has to get them down really quickly because darkness is coming. So they coil up the rope that they brought. They add into a sledge. The three men sit on it and they slide down a snowbank 3,000 feet, descending 3,000 feet in 12 seconds. I love this moment. They stand up get out of the snow. They stand up, and I think this is so British, and they all solemnly shake hands. And then they travel on. They're so exhausted that Shackleton says to Worsley and Koehn, let's have a kip, which is an English word for nap. Let's have a nap. Well, Shackleton realizes he can't go to sleep because if they go to sleep, they'll freeze and they'll die. So he lets them sleep for 5 minutes and wakes them up and says, you've been asleep for 40 minutes. Aren't you refreshed? Let's keep going. And so it takes them 36 hours of this very difficult journey to get to the whaling station. They knock on the captain's door. This is May 10th, 1916. And the captain says, who are you? Because they had all given Shackleton up for dead. Right. And they're bearded. These men haven't showered, and you do the math. Right.
They took freaking screws out of the ship and they put them through their shoes so they would have crampons. And modern mountain climbers today, they look at what they did. And they say with today's modern equipment, it would be hard. I have no idea how they did it with that. What they had.
No idea. So anyway, long and short. So no one can believe this, that they're alive. They don't hardly recognize Shackleton and Koehn and Worsley, freshen up, eat a good meal. And then immediately Shackleton is trying to get a boat from the whaling station to get back and rescue his men 800 miles southwest of where he is. It takes him, now we're in phase 5. It takes him 4 different boats, 4 different attempts, beginning in mid-May and taking him all the way to the end of August 1916 to actually get through the pack ice. There's so much ice. He keeps sailing with it, trying to get to Elephant Island and turning back because he's worried this little ship he's in, there are 4 different ones, will get caught in the ice again. And it takes him till late August 30th, 1916, in a little Chilean tugboat called the Yelko, he and Worsley still with him, to get to all the way to Elephant Island. As they're coming in, the ship is coming to them, the men start coming out of the little tents they've made of the overturned lifeboats, and Shackleton starts counting. He's on the deck of the Yelko, and Worsley's with him. We're counting the story years later. He's counting 1, 2, and he gets to 22, and he realizes they're all alive, and Worsley said, the worry and the aging of his face just slid away. He was so thrilled that his team was alive. They load them all back up on the Yelko, and they sail for South America and then for London, where basically everyone's forgotten because the World War is still going on, right? Late summer 1916. Everyone's forgotten about the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, right? In the carnage, the mass carnage of World War I. Most of the men come home and enlist, and then unbelievably, it's like a Shakespeare tragedy, 2 of the men are killed in Flanders on the battlefield after surviving all that.
Oh, gosh.
And then Shackleton goes to work on the lecture tour in America trying to pay the debts of the Endurance expedition and is largely largely then slides into the mists of history, where the whole story is briefly resurrected by the BBC in the 1930s and then really largely eclipsed by other stories until a guy named Roland Huntford, the most brilliant polar historian we have, resurrects the story in the 1980s, and Shackleton becomes one of the hottest and most interesting figures of crisis leadership in the world, where he has remained for 35 years.
That has to be the greatest example of crisis leadership. Abraham Lincoln, who's obviously in your book, that's a different journey of many, many years. But just in terms of physical, emotional, interpersonal, intense, can't get away from it. Is there a more intense survival story than that?
I think it's about the greatest survival story we have, and it's replete. Don't read The Endurance. Read my book, because my book is better. And read this. It's not just a chapter. It's a long, like mini biography. It's the most comprehensive tale of the Endurance with respect to leadership that was written. The best book on Shackleton is a book called simply Shackleton by Roland Huntford, this fantastic historian who's a great writer, and has also written about the Scott and Amundsen rivalry. And that book, The Last Place on Earth, is brilliant. So there's lots of good stuff out there. But the really important thing here with Shackleton, I think, to take away is that the impossible is made possible, right, by courageous, resilient leaders, deeply committed to a worthy mission and willing to play any card to achieve that mission.
Yeah. My apologies, Nancy. I was pointing people to that book I read decades ago called The Endurance. You're right. Your stuff.
It started the whole interest in Shackleton, but I wouldn't be a very good mother to my book if I didn't shamelessly promote it.
Well, Nancy, I got to tell you, I've never wanted to go back to college, let alone to the Ivy League, but I'm about ready to go to Harvard just so I could sit under your teaching. Damn, woman, that's unfreaking believable. That's fantastic. How does this tie for you, Nancy? This crisis theme, and I'm feeling like I want to have you back as often as I can. We're just barely scratching the surface of Shackleton, let alone Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, Bonhoeffer, Rachel Carson. So I'd love to do a return at some point. But
I'm doing John Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis now at Harvard, and then I'm doing John Lewis and the Civil Rights Movement. Both amazing crisis leaders. So I'm sorry I interrupted you, but. What you were going to say? How does it tie?
Yeah, so I was going to ask you your personal story. How has your personal story caused you to be so interested in this topic?
So that's a great question, and very few people ever ask me. Although I've talked a lot about this book over the years, and spun it off into all kinds of different things. I think the reason I stumbled into these stories, and I fall into a canyon of interest, read and start thinking, hey, this is a great story. I need to tell this story. I think in my case, the reason Forged in Crisis became Forged in Crisis is because beginning in the very early noughts, a bunch of really crazy stuff happened, really crazy stuff. So my father died in 2002. My mother, who we children didn't realize depended on him, she collapsed and became just a shadow of her former self. My husband, to whom I've been married for 14 years, walked out one day with no warning. I then, within a year, got cancer, breast cancer. I had no risk factors. And then a few years later, I got breast cancer again, despite being treated at this extraordinary hospital called Dana-Farber in Boston. I remember my breast surgeon saying to me, Nancy, the odds of this happening are like 1 in 400,000, you getting cancer again, given the first time. It was a whole bunch of stuff just happened that was really hard. And I think some part of me shook my fist at the sky and said, with God as my witness, I want to get something decent, redeem this somehow. And I think the book is partly an answer to that in crisis, there is opportunity. And the most important opportunity is what we can do within ourselves to rise to our higher or better self. Yeah. And so the book is about that, with lots of attention to the impact, right, that these people had, the larger impact they had coming out from themselves in a crisis situation.
If you think about you went through two difficult things, or you went through a bunch of difficult things, physical issues and then emotional issues. What do you think is harder to endure as a human being or as a leader? Is it physical things or is it emotional things?
Well, it's hard to separate them out, right? Because when you have cancer, there's always the question, and it's very, very rarely not an issue, which is this life threatening, right? That's why cancer strikes such fear when you hear the word into people's hearts, because it is so often potentially life threatening. So once you're in that land or even near that particular county line, you're into the emotional. Right? How do I not just survive and not just cope, but somehow manage to harness some of this to be as strong and as resilient as I can? Because there is good evidence that emotional, well-being affects physiological outcome. And I knew that. So I knew that I had a responsibility not to cave in to all, I'm a warrior, and not to cave in to all my kind of negative voices, but to stay as strong and positive and realistic as I could as I navigated, for example, the second cancer, which was much more serious than the first. So I think it's hard to separate them. I think most people have more tools to deal with the physical. Yeah. So that makes the emotional piece harder, because we're not trained to, we can find good doctors and ask them good questions and get people to go to the appointments with us. It's not, how do we keep ourselves resilient, aware, and highly functioning emotionally? Those are not things we're taught, most of us, as we grow up.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're just generally soft. I think regularly that if America had to go back and do World War II again with our current population, we would be in a hard way. 70% of American males, 70% of American males couldn't meet the basic physical requirements to get in the Army today. That's 70%, right?
Wow.
Yeah, it's not a good thing. And then I also think that we're just not as hardy as we used to be. I mean, emotionally, physical things I'm pretty good at, but emotional things are the things that wipe me out. So the emotional aspect of what Shackleton did, keeping all of those guys on the up and up and bearing that weight on your soul, that was tough. So given that's my preamble, today as a leadership guru, what outages do you think that we have as leaders that people of Shackleton's generation didn't have? What things are we accepting as just the reality of leadership today that we're accepting because we have our modern view versus maybe a more ancient, maybe a little more hardy view?
I don't think that hardiness is a function of time periods.
Okay.
I think, or that somehow the Victorians and the Edwardians, right? Edwardians meaning early first decades of the 20th century in England. I don't think they were hardier, so to speak. I think, but I'm right on your wavelength. So that's the prologue. The meat of what I want to say is I think that people are tested, and what testing is, right? Whether it's cancer or the death of a parent at a very young age or a very sick child, all kinds of ways we're tested. The thing about being tested is when you say to yourself, I'm going to get bigger through this and not smaller. This is the key criterion. This is the fork in the road, right? As opposed to I'm a victim. I'm going to get better. I'm going to get through this. And somehow, I hope it's correct, even if I don't know how, I'm going to get better. When that happens, you get stronger.
Right.
You get stronger. And our generation, man, now we're back in the time period. So this is why we're so aligned. We have models of taking care of kids. We have models of institutions that are all about trying to make people feel comfortable.
Yes.
Life gives you no free ride out of discomfort.
Right.
It's not supposed to. So I think that we have way too much emphasis on comfort and not enough emphasis on how do we grow through different twists and turns and tribulations to grow fuller, wiser, stronger, more resilient, and more compassionate.
Right. Right. And
we're not asking the right questions about what constitutes a life well lived for ourselves and for everyone else.
Right. And then when we are uncomfortable, someone's to blame. Someone did something wrong. They're bad planning. Or if I can't find somebody, then let me blame God. God doesn't love me, or there is no God. There is no God because I feel uncomfortable. Or a very sensitive topic for us. I'm not making a soapbox out of this, but you wonder how many of those people, the DNA of in Shackleton's crew, if they were born today with the exact same DNA, how many of them would have been prescribed anti-anxiety medicine, depression medicine, OCD, or like you used to have to work through things like that. You used to have to grin and bear it until instead of just, I feel bad, get a pill right now.
Someone once said to me in the midst of some very difficult moment, I think it was in the middle of the long, hairy divorce, someone said, there's no way around this, Nancy. You just have to go through it. Yeah. And that is so true. Most of the important stuff in life, we don't go around, whether it's joy or satisfaction or grief or resilience or caretaking. We have to go through. And again, do you want to go through and be better for it, or do you want to go through and be blaming? I can't really understand exactly how this happened, but by God, I'm going to emerge stronger and more luminous. Or do you want to go through saying, why me? I did a show with Charlie Rose right after my book came out, at the round table and all this, before Charlie Rose stopped being, a person of great repute. And he said, what did you learn from the experience of writing this book and all your question and your personal story? And I said, I learned to stop asking why. That why doesn't really get you. You learn from your mistakes. That's important. But then why and how am I suddenly, the victim of bad fate? That doesn't get you anywhere. And I think the why question is dangerous when we want to succumb to being a victim, because that doesn't get you anywhere.
Well, I knew you personally had to own this message. You can't just do research and go down the canyon of information, as you said, and just have a bunch of knowledge, book knowledge, without it connecting to your heart and your personal journey. I knew those two things melded up, which is part of why. I mean, you're just a great speaker. I never heard you speak, but I can tell when somebody is on a podcast. You're not just a really great communicator, but this is one of those things where your mental knowledge and your life story just melded together. Just powerful, Nancy. Just powerful. I want to have you on again. It's just freaking great.
Look forward to it already, Brian.
Nancy, is there anything you wanted to talk about in this topic that we haven't talked about or I haven't asked you?
I would just like to say to your listeners that the great thing about this story, and I think a lot of the stories that I'm drawn to, are these stories of people who literally, ordinary people who make themselves capable of doing extraordinary things, right, for a good cause. I'm not talking about, hey, how do I construct an internet scam. I mean, these are people who have worthy causes. And so in an age that's has a lot of negativity in it, our age has so much toxicity and so much negativity and not enough attention to our better, stronger selves and what we can do, not only for ourselves, but for our fellow people and creatures. These stories, Shackleton's story is the story of a person who really made a great difference in an extremely improbable situation. And what he did to do that, because he was an ordinary person, is I think useful to all of us trying to lead lives of light and meaning and decency. So the storytelling is powerful, and I want to just recommend it to your listeners. But find the right stories of decency and light, and focus on those, because there's a lot of truth and a lot of meaning and a lot of direction in those tales.
Well, you got 5 great stories in your book, Forged in Crisis, The Making of 5 Courageous Leaders. I'll say them again: Shackleton, Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Rachel Carson. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a lot of people don't know. I just was over in Germany learning more about him just a few months ago. So, this is fantastic. Nancy, if someone wants to follow up with you or get more of your stuff, just give an advertisement for yourself.
So I'm on X. If you want to find me, I have a Facebook page. I have a website, nancykoehn.com, and there's all kinds of video, all kinds of stuff. I mean, everything you can possibly want on nancykoehn.com.
I don't think I said your name right off the bat.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Oh, well, you said it exactly the way you're supposed to, the way it looks.
All right.
But my parents made it Koehn when they had their first child, and so I'm Koehn.
Yeah. Okay. Her name is Nancy Koehn. She's at Harvard. I need to go there now. Now I need to go there. This is seriously one of the most stimulating conversations I've had in a while. And you're just a really great communicator, great storyteller, very, very wise woman. Nancy, I'm thankful for how you've endured. I'm thankful for how you have, you've gone through a knothole, and you're blessing and helping people on the other side, including all of us. So thank you very much. I don't know what you learned here today, guys and ladies. I don't know what it is. This is not the podcast for interesting ideas. This is the podcast for doing things that are aggressive. Nancy just didn't say the word aggressive, but every last thing she talked about was an aggressive move, aggressive mistake, aggressive decision that Shackleton made. There's something here that you need to do, and maybe it's just hold on a little bit longer. Just hold on. We'll see you next time on The Aggressive Life. Thanks for joining us on this journey toward aggressive living. Find more resources, articles, past episodes, and more at briantome.com. Pre-orders for my newest book, a 60-day devotional called The 5 Marks for Man, 60 Days to a Powerful Life, are open right now on Amazon, along with all the other books in the 5 Marks library. Be sure to leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcast. Then send an email to that's dirt@briantome.com to get a free Aggressive Life sticker. Find more on Instagram at Brian Tome. The Aggressive Life is a production of Crossroads Church, Cincinnati, Ohio.